Welcome to Electric Evolution with Liz Allan. This podcast is about the journey to a more sustainable future in order for us to be able to do our bit to achieve net zero. I'll be discussing a variety of topics with experts in their field in order to educate and increase our knowledge of clean energy, electric vehicles and the electric vehicle infrastructure. So whether you're an individual wanting to make a difference at home, a small business or a corporate, this podcast is just for you. Okay, so on today's episode, I have got Colin Walker, and he is the Head of Transport at the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit. We met last week, Colin, so it's lovely to see you again.
Pleasure. Nice to see you. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for joining. So just to give a little bit of your backstory, so you worked for British Cycling previously, but you've worked in the charity sector for quite a while, haven't you? So And I saw on some information about you, which was you'd rolled out the traffic light system for food choices, which I found was really interesting. I always love digging into a little bit of people's backstory. So do you want to just give us a little bit of background and, you know, kind of fill those gaps in?
Sure, yeah. I guess I left uni trying to figure out what to do. Kind of always, without sounding cheesy, wanted to do something which I felt I was helping make the world slightly better through the work that I was doing. And kind of found myself working in the world of policy, advocacy, campaigning. And that took me to different organisations like the British Library, the mental health charity Minds, the consumer organisation Which, Save the Children, War Child, to name a few. And yeah, each of these organisations was kind of like campaigning primarily for governments to introduce policies that would kind of like help benefit a particular group within either Britain or globally. So whilst I wasn't responsible as maybe for actually rolling out the traffic light labelling scheme, but certainly something when I was at Which we campaigned for, recognising that we faced a bit of an obesity crisis in the UK, and a lot of that was driven by the food that we ate, and a lot of that was down to the fact that it was difficult for people to understand what was in their food, and we really wanted to see a simple traffic light labelling scheme that would very quickly allow people to kind of get a sense of the relative healthiness or unhealthiness of the food that they were buying. As you can imagine, we came up against a lot of resistance, particularly from the food industry, who didn't maybe want the incredibly high content of salt, sugar and fat in the foods they were selling us to be so well known. And the strength of that lobby was huge, but getting there was quite a success. So that's been good fun.
I was going to say, for something like that, it is. I can imagine that there was a lot of resistance. I worked for a while, kind of in the food industry, so. And I know exactly what was going on. I was actually for quite a while. I was a judge on the Free From Food Awards, and we'd get things coming through, and you'd get home sort of quite small companies coming through where with really small amounts of ingredients on the on the information, but then you get like mass production companies and there'd be this whole raft of ingredients on there. It was just ridiculous. We were like, why do you need all of these things in these foods, so I totally get it. But you moved into British Cycling as well, didn't you?
I took a bit of a career break, went and lived abroad for a few months, then came back, and my main hobby is cycling, and then I saw a job that was available there, and it was what a wonderful opportunity to actually work at an organisation that kind of runs the sport that you love. So yeah, worked there for a time as a kind of like their lead for London and Central England. And yeah, like an awful lot of the work we're doing is trying to encourage cycling uptake. I was particularly interested in the, how shifting people onto bikes and away from, petrol and diesel cars is one of the means by which you can help reduce our CO2 emissions. Suffice to say, I wasn't particularly happy when British Cycling then decided to take sponsorship from Shell.
Oh God!
So that kind of conflicted a little bit with those values.
Yeah.
That decision was made after I left, but I'd heard rumours doing the rounds that it was happening, so I felt a bit uncomfortable, and I'd always wanted to get into the climate change space. So yeah, this opportunity at the CIU came up, and I kind of grasped it with both hands, and the rest is history, really.
So come on, so tell us a little bit about what the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit.
Quite grandiose, isn't it?
It does sound like you kind of Men in Black kind of thing.
Sadly, as you can tell, don't necessarily fit that kind of Men in Black profile.
I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a Greenwich name, or ECIU for short. It makes it a bit easier. But we've existed since 2014, and it was largely set up out of recognition that obviously a huge number of changes and technological innovations were going to need to be rolled out as the UK made the move to net zero, and that there's going to be, like there always is with any kind of major technological shift, an awful lot of misinformation said. And we were concerned that a lot of our political leaders who ultimately determine how we're going to get to net zero would be influenced by the stuff they read in the press, and a lot of stuff they read in the press was just not a fair representation of the facts. So that's why we established ourselves. Then the transport program was created, that I was recruited to set up, just about 18 months ago. Recognition that transport was becoming increasingly marred by misinformation. And whilst I am head of transport, and that's obviously a big brief, 90 odd % of my work is looking at EVs, because that's where, for two reasons really. One, decarbonising our private cars is the most important thing we need to do within transport. I mean, it's worth remembering that people forget this because so much attention is paid to the conversations happening around solar panels and offshore wind farms, etc. The single biggest sector in terms of CO2 emissions is transport.
Yeah.
And whilst the power sector in the UK actually has done pretty well in terms of decarbonising, I mean, we produce nowhere near the CO2 we did 20 years ago, and the complete ditching of coal and the kind of sudden increase in like offshore wind is a success.
Yes.
Transport has kind of plateaued. Any efficiencies we saw in like the technological innovation within internal combustion engines has been wiped out by we're all driving much heavier cars. So we have to do something about that sector, and you cannot do anything about decarbonising that sector if you don't focus on cars, which are responsible for over like half the emissions that transport in the UK produces. And so that was the main reason why we felt it was a priority, and we, as an organisation, were just seeing the level of misinformation doing the rounds about EVs. And it was becoming, and it still is, prevalent. It's how an awful lot of our press is kind of leans towards reporting the misinformation rather than the facts. And that has a real problem in terms of undermining consumer confidence in making a move to EVs, but also just an awful lot of our politicians are just influenced by what they're reading and have got themselves the wrong idea about the realities of EV transition. And sometimes they have to vote on important stuff like the introduction of a zero-emission vehicle mandate. We were really concerned that they were going to vote. How they were going to vote was going to be informed by the stuff they were reading in the press. So that's what we exist to do, is try to get the actual facts in there, or counteract the stuff that just quite simply isn't true.
It's just mind-boggling, the number of things that you actually hear that are negative coming from
Yep.
the press. So no wonder people, like you say, I hadn't thought about it that way. I suppose my thinking was, and I don't know whether other people thought like this, that they would have, because they have advisors, don't they? But so we're saying that none of these know because they're all just listening to the press.
Well, I imagine if you're a politician or an advisor working in the office, you are bombarded by so many different sources of information. And there's been an awful lot of success that those have a vested interest in maybe trying to slow the transition down, kind of like confusing the picture and putting stats out there that contradict what the actual evidence tells us or what the scientific community is telling us. And so sometimes those who shout the loudest get heard the best.
Yeah.
And there's so many other different factors that kind of drive it forward. But I think an awful lot of it is just, which you see every time there's a kind of a shift to a new technology, just this innate resistance or fear of change. The Daily Mail ran a campaign to save our incandescent light bulbs. Remember them? That burns like 600 watts a bulb, and now we're burning LED watts that are just as good, that use barely 5.
Yeah.
It's literally a front page Daily Mail campaign to save our incandescent light bulbs. The same newspaper once predicted that the internet would never catch on. There's a columnist, I can't remember his name, who often writes in the Telegraph having a go at EVs, who once famously predicted that he didn't think the iPhone would ever become anything more than a niche product. So these people are consistently proven to be wrong, but the same dynamic happens every time that there's a technological move. You know, there are lots of scare stories said about cars when they're first invented, presumably by the horse lobby. You know,
Of
it's
course, yeah.
same things were said about trains and it was spread by the owners of canals because their business model was threatened by this new technological innovation. So it's just history repeating itself, and I am confident that it won't be enough to derail the transition. I think the technology is too good and the benefits are too obvious, particularly for those who actually make the move and then experience them. I think it will. My main concern is the pace at which a transition will happen could be significantly slowed by all this disinformation. And the slower it goes, two consequences of that: all the money you can save by owning an EV, that's lost to people if they stay with their diesel and petrol cars for longer, and obviously they'll just keep producing CO2. And we're in the middle of a climate crisis.
Yeah.
We're really off target to hit the 1.5 that everyone says we need to do to avoid kind of really catastrophic effects. So slowing down is a really problematic thing. So yeah, that's my concern.
It kind of makes you think, it makes you wonder, what do people actually want? Do they want to be proven to be wrong? You know, because it's kind of, I know I've said this before about the vested interests about oil and gas, and I'll say it again. We can talk about that, but it just feels like that at some point, all of these people, like you kind of said about the Daily Mail writer or the Telegraph writer, why are they doing this? Just to be proven wrong at some point and made to be look like a bit of a twit.
Mm-hmm. Good question.
Do they believe it themselves?
I mean, unfortunately, I can't get inside their heads. All I can do is speculate. I'd love to, but I don't know. Because I keep on looking at going, all these things you're saying, firstly, not borne by the facts, so you kind of make yourself look a bit silly. But B, particularly nowadays with social media, there is going to be a written record of you being wrong.
Yeah.
I just don't. I think an awful lot of them were convinced that they're right. So just don't countenance that idea that one day they're going to prove that they were on the wrong side of history and that all the fear-mongering they spread was just complete nonsense. I also think some will claim that all their work that they did to flag their concerns about the transition. So what we'll do is we'll get there. Everyone will be driving EVs and all the kind of like terrifying things that people said, that our car parks will collapse, everyone will be spontaneously bursting into flame, we'll all be stranded in like snow drifts because of all that snow we have in the UK. Because EVs can't handle snow. All these kind of things we've proven to be wrong. But I think they'll claim, but the reason it worked is because we raised the concerns at the time and they were subsequently addressed. So we helped influence the move.
Oh, God.
Which I'm like, no. But they will try. But this is an important issue because some of the concerns that people have are completely genuine. They're completely fair. There are, no transition to a new technology is perfect. There's definitely going to be like kind of bumps along the way.
Yeah.
Our charging infrastructure is not where it will need to be. Unsurprising. You don't just suddenly go from 0 to 100 in terms of going. You don't just randomly go, bang, there you go, UK, that's the infrastructure you need. It gets developed over time. And yes, if we don't carry on building it and build them in the right places, we will have a problem. And I do think newspapers that flag these concerns can use their influence to actually shape government policy to get them to be a bit better at installing infrastructure that we need. So I think that stuff's kind of fair. I think there's a real problem we're facing in that EVs are spectacularly cheap to run if you have a driveway, and this blows people's minds, they get very angry with me on Twitter. I point out that 60 to 70% of UK households have private off-street parking. And no, they're not. You're like, they do. So the majority of people can run EVs very cheaply, but that leaves a sizable minority that can't.
Yeah.
And it's just not, and particularly since, on the whole, it's a sweeping generalisation, but on the whole, people in poorer households live in houses without driveways, right?
Yeah.
On the whole. I mean, in London, where a terraced house costs £1.5 million, £2 million, maybe a bit different. On the whole, that's the case. And if you can't charge your car at home cheaply on an Octopus nighttime EV charging tariff, and you have to rely on public charging, you have to pay a lot more to fuel your EV.
You do, yeah.
And that seems unfair. That's saying poorer people have to pay more to run an EV than richer people. Now, that is completely unreasonable. So, again, that's an example of a challenge that is fair, that I would much rather see the papers use their influence to try to help push government to resolve those challenges, Where at the moment, I feel that they're too focused on spreading nonsense that just quite simply isn't true. Cars burst on fire, car parks will collapse, blah, blah, blah. But also they have this really slightly frustrating, understating, frustrating mindset, which is there is this problem with the EV transition. And rather than think, right, what can we do? How can we pressure government to fix it? They go to, let's call the whole thing off. It's not perfect, let's call the whole thing off.
Yeah.
And that mindset is infuriating.
But that, to me, is about those negative clicks because as a society, and I don't know whether this is worldwide or whether it's just the UK, we quite like a bit of negative stuff, don't we? Do you know what I mean? And positive word of mouth transfers slower than negative word of mouth. If you go to a restaurant and that restaurant's a bit crap, you're more likely to tell your mates that the restaurant's a bit crap and don't go there, aren't you? Do you know what I mean? And it's kind of like that, isn't it? Really, it's sort of like let's keep it negative.
There's a phrase I'm going to completely butcher. It's something like a lie travels around the world before the truth has got its boots on, or there's something like that. It's like, yeah, you're right, and at that point, the fact that that's difficult. Given a lot of my work is about trying to get stuff placed in the press.
Yeah.
It's hard because the story I'm trying to sell is the truth. The reality about EVs and EV ownership is a good news story. They don't set on fire. Car parks don't collapse under them. They are much cheaper to run. They are much better for the environment. And like newspapers are like, yeah, but I really want to sell a story that says that this EV went out of control and had to be stopped by the police 130 miles an hour. Or you mean the one where the driver was subsequently arrested for dangerous driving? That one, oh, okay. But that's what they want to sell. So it's much easier for those trying to slow the EV transition by spreading negative, bad news about EVs. It's very easy to pitch that because, as you say, an awful lot of people are naturally want to read those stories. I also think there's a whole thing about confirmation bias. An awful lot of people, because of this general anxiety about change, want to believe that EVs are rubbish and will read newspapers that confirm that prejudice they have against them. So we know, so many papers like The Sun, The Mail, The Telegraph, The Times will print these stories because it's something they know a lot of their readership want. So that's a hard loop to break. And I think one of the key breaks, the one thing that I think will trump the misinformation that people are seeing on social media, which we haven't even spoken about, YouTube and TikTok as a source for this stuff is a whole other problem. But they see in the press, I think they'll get trumped when they start. More and more people have a close friend or family member that has an EV that says, ignore that nonsense you're reading. It's brilliant. It's fine. It's so much better than the car I had before. And I say that because there's plenty of surveys that show that 90% of people who've got an EV would never go back to petrol or diesel. I'm confident that mechanism is probably the thing that will drive more and more people to get EVs. It's like in the early days when someone got an iPhone. And more had them, more and more people then wanted them, So.
Exactly that. And at the moment we've got 1 million drivers.
Yeah.
And it might not sound a lot because how many people we got in the UK?
That's 60 odd million, 65 million.
So
I mean, we've got 40 odd million vehicles on the road, I think.
But if you think about it, if you've got 1 million drivers driving EVs, they've all got family and friends. So there's going to be more than 1 million people that think, actually this is all right. So at some point, I suppose that it is that tipping point. It's the tipping point towards positivity rather than negativity, isn't it?
We did a survey we did some polling last year and found that of the people we polled, 52% knew a close friend or family member that had an EV.
And that's good.
Yeah, so it felt like quite a significant moment that we tipped over more people know someone with an EV than people that don't. And, we asked them, have these people, what have they said they like their EV? And they're saying like the vast majority of them, the people they spoke to about their EV said, yeah, these things are great. So that tipping point has happened, but let's also we've got to acknowledge the fact that the rate of growth of new EV sales is slowing. It's a lot of people deliberately misinterpreting, go, EV sales are stalling or EV sales are going down. They're not, they're still going up, but they're not going up as fast. And actually as a share of overall new market sales, they have gone down a little bit. So there's still something happening there that we need to understand a little better. I personally believe a lot of the misinformation that I'm having to address is responsible for undermining consumer confidence. But so there's still something that knowing people who've got an EV still hasn't fixed everyone's anxiety. So there's still more to do.
But do you think so? And maybe I'm wrong. So the push to get the EV sales out at year end, usually end of December, is so in some ways maybe there was a spike. I don't. Maybe I'm totally wrong here. There tends to sometimes be like a spike at the end year end, doesn't there? And then it drops off because everybody's pushing for sales because they know it's their year end. Let's push. So then when it gets to January or between the first quarter, maybe that's why, because actually, we can take the foot off the gas a little bit. Excuse the pun there.
I hope so. Maybe I'm not as positive because what EVs as a proportion of new car sales in 2022 was 16.6%. 2023 that went down by a fraction to 16.5%. 2024 so far they were at 15%. And they need to be at 22% in 2020.
Yeah.
So the mandate that came into force at the beginning of the year. So I think there's another dynamic going on. I think consumer confidence has been hit by constant misinformation, by government flip-flopping on this when they had introduced the 2030 phase-out date for ICE things, and then party conferences last year, Rishi Sunak then pushed it back to 2035. Both the Office of Budget Responsibility and Auto Trader have both said that has impacted consumer confidence. People feel they've got a bit longer to make the transition, so that has slowed things down, and that has not helped. I mean, manufacturers are trying to push them. There's a lot more adverts for EVs out there now. I went and had a look at an EV6 a couple of weekends ago, and they were talking about offering like £4,000 to the deposit if you got it on a PCP deal. It's quite generous, I think. And they made the point, we've got to get these things out the door because of this government target. So there's definitely a push. I also think this has all coincided with every time you have a technological kind of innovation, you have this bell curve at which people adopt them, right? And the first cohort of people that get them are the early adopters. And I think the early adopters have adopted. And so we're now having to transition to the next group, the early mainstream. And that always results in a slowing because there's a bit of a leap because those people are maybe a little more hesitant, a little more skeptical than those people that went first. So but I think that's where we are now, is making that leap to that next big group. And typically what you'll see with any other technological innovation, once you make that leap and people in that group start buying them, the pace accelerates again. And that will coincide with Auto Trader have said we're pretty much at price parity on second-hand EVs compared to their petrol equivalents. So that idea that the upfront cost is a barrier has kind of gone a little bit because most people buy their cars in the second-hand market, and second-hand EVs are no more expensive to buy than their petrol equivalents. But I also think we'll see, hopefully we're going to start seeing these cheaper models like the Dacia Spring, the Renault 5.
Yes.
Does Tesla actually introduce a new model for the first time in a long time and actually introduce a model that large numbers of people actually want, rather than the Cybertruck, which is
it's a bit ridiculous looking, isn't it?
But it works. To be honest, it's a huge vehicle, a huge amount of resources. Would seem ridiculous on British roads. I don't think it'd get on British roads because of safety standards here. I just don't see how. But I think in the US, where the pickup truck is king, and where drivers of pickup trucks likely to be the people in society who are probably particularly skeptical of electric vehicles, I think that's the kind of vehicle you need to kind of pull them over. Tesla, I think, in a lot of its other markets, needs to introduce this £25,000 budget EV. It could make a real difference. So we're beginning to see those models coming. And hopefully that will have an impact on uptake as well.
Yeah, I hope so. And actually, I don't know whether you know, so we bought our EV was used. We got a 2021 Ioniq last year, and actually, it wasn't a bad deal. In fact, it was cheaper than when we bought. Cheaper to buy the electric that we bought than we did. We paid less by a few £100, fair enough, but than we did with our petrol Golf.
And out of interest, do you know what the battery health was of it when you got it?
Do you know, this is another question. I was talking to, there's another podcast will go out around the same time as this. At the time, no, because we only had about, I think there was 12 or 14,000 miles on the clock. But I know that our vehicle has actually there's other vehicles that have done like 200,000 miles and the battery health has been at like 92%. So I'm not expecting that. I will do it, but actually in some ways there's not really any point in doing it because I know that it's going to be at around 100%
No,
battery health.
exactly. That's why I asked, because I think that's one of the, when we talk about all the different narrative challenges, that's one of the biggies that I'd
I
like to
agree.
focus on more, because so many people are anxious, and I get it, because buying a car, is a huge amount of money. When you're buying a second-hand, it doesn't come with that same 8-year warranty you get from the beginning when you buy new. And so a lot of people are really anxious about buying a vehicle and then suddenly being told they're going to have to fork out a fortune to replace the battery.
Yeah.
What a lot of people tell you is going to happen. But all the evidence I've seen is that the battery degradation is minimal. Like Which did a survey that found that even the people who drove around in the oldest EVs, the ones that kind of turned up at around 2014, the average battery health of those vehicles was still 92%.
Yeah. Yeah.
You're like, so I think that is something more needs to be done. But I know Auto Trader are kind of pushing for government to actually introduce kind of a standardized scheme or score thing where whenever you're buying an EV secondhand, it tells you what the battery health is or what the reliability of these batteries from this manufacturer are, which I think would be really good, just to kind of prove, look, seriously, there's nothing to worry about, but hopefully it will give people what they need, that confidence to make that
I
first
I
buy.
totally agree. I totally agree. It's something, I didn't, because ours only had such low mileage, because I was looking for something around like I say 12, 14,000 miles. And I didn't think that there would be an issue with the battery, but actually having something in writing that says this car has got this percentage battery health would really have given me even more confidence, and other consumers. An EV is not like an Apple phone or an Android phone. Its battery doesn't knacker within like 3 years, does it? Do you know what I mean? It's not like that. They've got battery management systems in them. So actually, but if you floor it and you treat it badly, then yes, it will degrade the battery a bit. It probably more than it would do if somebody was driving it more economically.
Yeah.
But it is not like driving an iPhone. It's not like that, is it?
But then people don't have any other frame of reference. The only other thing
Exactly.
they have is an iPhone. So the assumptions are made that, EVs will go for the same thing. And they won't. All the evidence is that stat I quoted about surveys showing that EVs retain their health, even the really old ones. Nissan have come out and said the batteries of the EVs last longer than the cars. The cars get scrapped and the battery can be recycled or repurposed for other things. Like I think a load of Nissan Leaf batteries are now being used to provide backup storage at Ajax's stadium in Amsterdam.
Yeah.
There's stories of Teslas on the road with 300,000 miles on the clock, still on the original battery. That is a classic. That is an example of a misleading narrative that I think is one of the most impactful on consumer confidence. They're going to be done. I think we need to do more on that.
Because I suppose if you think about it, in what we're still in a cost of living crisis, people want to, like you say, people want to make sure that when they buy something because a car and a house are the two most expensive things you're going to pay for, aren't they? And cars, no matter whether petrol, diesel or electric, depreciate, but actually it's not just the depreciate. If you're going to keep a car and run it until whenever, you want to actually really, recognize, or you want to be sure that battery is going to be okay for the length of time that you have it, and you'll be able to pass it on to somebody else and they'll be fine with it, so
But that's why I always say to people, just if you've got anxieties about these things, go and speak to an EV driver.
yeah.
Don't listen to what some bloke called Jeff on YouTube has said to you, or like some bloke you've met in the. Sorry, my dog's making weird noises at my feet. So I'm just going to let him out. Bear with me.
All right.
Okay.
All right. I'll make sure Tom, can you cut that little bit? That's all right. I have a wonderful podcast producer who will be cutting that.
So, yeah, just go and speak to an EV driver. It's the best thing you can do is go, look, I've read this thing, or this bloke called Dan in the pub told me this about what happens to the batteries, and you end up having to pay £20,000 to replace it, and oh my God. Well, go and speak to someone who actually has one. Do you have any problems with your batteries? It's like, no, it's at 96% health and it's about 4 or 5 years old. It's going just fine. That's the best thing I could advise you. But I suppose that's easier said than done. And that's what I'm trying to do like looking ahead for the rest of the year is try to get the voices of EV drivers out there a little bit more. Publicise those voices. That would be good.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. So just going back a second, I was going to say the other thing that I think we need, we've talked about the dealerships pushing, kind of pushing EVs because of the ZEV mandate, but we also need dealership support in kind of supporting that the transition itself with regards to information. So when I was test driving EVs, this is, kind of last year, it was kind of quite, there wasn't really much support from the dealerships. I think there was there was a lack of incentive whereas there's an incentive now, because of ZEV. There was a lack of understanding and knowledge. It just seemed to be a real gap there, that actually if people are going to places they'd normally go to, which is the dealership, I in my local Hyundai dealership, I will try to avoid them because of the negativity that I got from them. And I was just thinking, I've got an EV now, and you're now saying I don't really agree with EVs.
Yeah, that's. I mean, I've heard that anecdotally quite a few times. People saying that dealers doing this, and I wonder how the car manufacturers feel about their dealers kind of like having a go at the products that they're paying them to sell.
Yeah.
These as you say, these manufacturers now hit targets. They need people to be kind of really kind of like telling people the truth about EV ownership and dispelling some of the myths. And it's not happening. Well, I mean, it must have been my experience when I went to see a driver, an EV dealer, Kia, a couple of weekends. He was very positive about it, but I think a lot of that is because they'd given a lot of all their dealer staff an EV as a company car.
Yes.
So little things like that will make people realise, oh yeah, these things were amazing. So yeah, and look, I think that expands to other areas, and I kind of get it. Look, I know a lot of people who say that often their local mechanic will tell them of all the horrors that EVs offer, and that's probably, you see it's similar in heat pumps. An awful lot of boiler installers and plumbers having a go at heat pumps because people perceive that this transition is a threat to their livelihood. I can understand that is one concern I think we don't talk about enough, is this profession that probably feels that this transition to EVs is a bit of a threat. I mean, and what more are we doing to reassure this profession, to offer those retraining opportunities so people don't talk it down because they are threatened by it. There is a bit of a chance. There's another reality of EVs, they're much more reliable. There's less to go wrong, there's less to fix, there's less to service. A lot of EVs don't really need servicing at all. So yeah, that is going to change kind of like the realities for some professions, but certainly not a reason not to make the transition. And certainly people like dealers should be getting trained up and encouraged to not talk these products down because it's not helpful.
No, exactly. In fact, you know what? I was actually at an event about 3 weeks ago now, talking about kind of it wasn't a dealership, but it was a chap who owned a garage, and so there was a panel discussion going on. And this chap asked a question, and he knew in the audience there were obviously people who were interested in transitioning, and his question was relating to the fact that his garage was being affected because of the fact that EVs don't need as much kind of maintenance. And it felt to me it's a difficult thing to deal with when you're on a panel, isn't it? When you get something like that, because that the other people would be listening to what he was saying, so he was being quite negative about the transition.
And the response, unfortunately, is quite a brutal one. And like, we didn't not make the transition from horse and carts to cars out of concern for the employment opportunities of farriers, right? We didn't call off a whole technological transition because people who put horseshoes on horses, which is a huge business, obviously, employed God knows how many people. We didn't stop it because the technological change was so beneficial in so many other ways that this was just one of the things you had to manage. And for the same reason, this transition to EVs is going to have to happen and will happen. And the thing is, this is the thing, like, new opportunities will emerge. we could go. I mean, I'm not an economics expert, but EVs save their drivers so much money. You know, over £1,000 a year in total cost of ownership. Total cost of ownership costs if you can run your vehicle and charge it from home. That gives people a lot more disposable income in their pockets. They'll spend on other things. So it'll generate economic opportunities elsewhere. So yeah, without going into the kind of like nuts and bolts of all that, it's not a reason not to make the transition to EVs.
No. And I was going to say, overall, over the last kind of 10, 20 years, there's been less to do in cars, just generally, hasn't there? Because, you know, I always say kind of like, you know, you've got the central brain of the car that kind of, you know, there's that's where, or so for example, last year we had a problem with our VW Golf, and that's part of it. We were already thinking about moving over anyway, but the infotainment system just totally kind of died on us, and VW were going to charge us £2,000 to get a new infotainment system, you know, which was just, oh my god, just thinking about it, it was like, well, so hang on, the central brain of the car, we're going to have to replace this whole thing. So I went through this massive palaver, you know. So it's just suffice to say, I only paid £300 to, and it was repaired by a chap up in Liverpool somewhere, and sent it back, and it worked, and it was fantastic. And I said to this guy, he needs to have a business, but you know, so things have changed in vehicles, haven't they? So there's a lot less to do generally anyway, other than the regular mechanic stuff.
There's quite an awful lot of being a car mechanic nowadays seems to be about plugging your laptop into the car,
Yes.
rather
Yeah.
than necessarily pulling stuff out and getting stuff done, getting yourself dirty. And that would presumably have required some retraining the mechanics to kind of deal with the fact that modern ICE vehicles were now much more computerized, and that ICU played a much more fundamental role in how the car was operated. So I presume it needs some retraining, and there will need to be some retraining for electric vehicles.
And I was going to say, there's a lot of skills that are needed. You know, I was at the REA a couple of weeks back now, and they were talking about skills, and the amount of skills that are needed in just all of the sectors that are involved in the transition to net zero is massive, isn't it?
Like you don't just servicing cars, you need people to kind of install and service charging points. That's going to become a bigger and bigger kind of feature of our economy.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a new economic opportunity, definitely, and you know, and then that moves the debate also onto the future of the UK's car industry. You know, our car industry generates well over £20 billion in export revenue every year alone. It employs directly and indirectly something like 800,000 people.
Wow.
And that's one of the other problems about, you talk the transition down or try to slow it here and say that the car industry should be supported to carry on building ICE vehicles rather than supported to make the transition to build the electric vehicles of the future. You're basically signing the death warrant of our car industry. And what think about, that's 20 billion less to spend on public services, and kind of like, you know, that's, you know, the tax revenue for that. That's an awful lot of jobs that go if you don't make that transition. So when people say that the move to EVs is a threat to our car industry, it's quite the opposite. If we don't embrace this, all of our major we export like 80% of our vehicles abroad, and over half of them go to the EU, which is introducing laws to formally phase out petrol and diesel cars. So does China, so an awful lot of American states. Them moving to EVs, that's going to be where the demand is going. And if we don't produce the products that those markets demand, they'll just buy them from someone else.
Of course they will.
So our car industry will wither and die in the vein if it is not supported to make the transition to EVs. And to be honest, this government's track record in implementing and rolling out an industrial strategy designed to help make that transition happen is not good. So yeah, that's when we, you know, an awful lot of people kind of fear change and highlight the consequences of what they think that change will involve. But I'm more concerned about the consequences of us not embracing that change, both environmentally and economically. They're huge.
I'd love to see some positivity coming through, but I think we're probably going to. There's only one way that we're going to be able to get that, and we'll see how that works later on in the year when we get to a general election. So, you know, but actually, if we had some positivity from the government, what kind of strategies would you be thinking that they need to start implementing to kind of to counteract all of the negativity that we've had? What support do we need in future from the government to kind of, we've talked about the tipping point, but actually we're talking about moving away from all this negativity. What do you think we need?
Well, the House of Lords earlier this year produced a report that kind of identified misinformation about EVs as one of the main barriers that's holding back the transition.
Yes.
And they called on the government to do more to tackle misinformation. I completely agree misinformation needs to be tackled. I'm just not sure if there's much the government can do, because I'm not sure of how much trust there is in the government. If the government says, you might have read this, well, actually it's this, people go, I don't trust your voice. You would say that. I'm not. You're trying to force us out of our cars. You would say this. So I'm not sure how much they can necessarily do in that space, although I'd like to see them try a bit more, be a bit more proactive. They have been guilty, I think, of saying we're going to do the ZEV mandate, we all need to be moving to EVs. But then when they pushed that phase out date back, it was kind of like pandering to the negative ideas that people had about electric vehicles.
Yeah.
By suggesting that they somehow were imposing a cost on households, when it's quite the opposite. So some of their actions they've undermined consumer confidence in the transition that they want all consumers to embark on. So that seems a bit unhelpful, so less of that, please. But in terms of practical things they can do, I think they could play a lot more interventionist kind of guiding role in kind of trying to speed up and coordinate the rollout of public charges. They could do a lot more there. And that's not all about necessarily throwing money at the problem. That's about removing the planning deadlocks that are resulting in planning applications for the installation of new charging points getting just stuck in local authorities for an enormous amount of time.
Yeah.
It's about just stopping this kind of postcode lottery about what kind of council you get in terms of their appetite to work with you to install things like a trench outside your terraced house so you can actually charge your car from your house rather than rely on a public charge point. There shouldn't be variation between local authorities. There should be a standardised, accelerated process by which those things can be installed across the country. And government could play a role in kind of breaking that deadlock and just kind of helping people access the considerable savings that come from EV ownership if you can charge your vehicle at home. I mean, EVs are still cheaper to run if you use slower public charging points, but it's just so much off the scale if you can do it at home. It's brilliant. So they could do an awful lot to kind of like really unlock those planning deadlocks, I think. And I think listen to people like Auto Trader who are saying more about there's something you could do to work with manufacturers to introduce a standard that demonstrated to people the kind of the quality and the health of the battery they're getting when they buy an EV secondhand. It's those kind of things they can do. It's not all about throwing money at the problem. It doesn't necessarily require subsidies to be reintroduced. Because I am a little sceptical about sometimes if your government offers a subsidy, does that subsidy get handed down to the consumer at the end of the day? Or does it get swallowed up by the car manufacturer? So I think the market forces have already brought EVs down to a place, or bringing them to a place where there's really not a much differential between the cost of a new EV and the cost of a new petrol car. That gap is narrowing, and it's certainly reached parity on the second-hand market. I think it's becoming less about price. Price is still a factor, or the perception that price is an issue is certainly a factor. But I think its anxiety is about charging. Its anxiety is about the health of the battery, of the longevity of the product that people are being encouraged to buy. There's more the government could do to address those things, but it's just quite passive at the moment.
So do you get an opportunity to talk to government about these things in the role that you're in then?
Our main communication with them is indirectly through the press, but we do. So I'm kind of hoping meeting with a few MPs in Parliament next week, and obviously we've got a general election on the horizon. So a lot of the MPs that we have now may well not be MPs at the next election.
Yeah. Yeah.
About biding your time a little bit, but I do think it's about trying to kind of build up a few more allies in Parliament who are willing to speak out a little more favourably on this issue, or speak out or challenge things said about EVs that are incorrect. Like John Redwood is quite vocal on Twitter about his thoughts about electric vehicles, and most of what he says is not rooted in fact. What more can be done to challenge those views by an elected member of the people, by another elected member of the people, of the population? So yes, there's more, but the major the major legislative moment to accelerate the EV transition has happened, which was, and fair play to the government for doing it. It's pretty much leading the world in terms of introducing kind of binding targets for the number of EVs that manufacturers have to sell. So it has to be 22% in this year, and that will rise every year until it hits 80% in 2030 and 100% by 2035. That's pretty good, but I do think targets like that need to be accompanied by some more proactive measures that address people's concerns about buying an EV. And I think a lot of that is charging and battery health.
Do you think that would be some kind of public information kind of campaign, that kind of thing? Do you think that'd help?
I think it would probably help, but I'm always wary about just relying on that solely.
Yeah.
I think there are like quite unglamorous things like that, introducing a standard for kind of like battery health.
Yeah.
There on an advert for the secondhand EV you're looking at, that you'll just see and go, the health of this battery is X%, or this is the quality. The batteries from this manufacturer are. I mean, it's an early idea, so it needs to be talked through. And I know Auto Trader have had a lot more thoughts on this and are pushing this one. So I'd like to kind of familiarise myself with it a little bit more. But I do think that just immediate if that is certified and from a quality source, and I think this is where government is trusted. If that's a government verified, kind of certified kind of like score or statements about the health of the battery you're buying, I think that will give consumers a lot of confidence. Because at the moment they don't see that, but what they do see is on social media going, "Ooh, you might end up paying 20 grand for a new battery. Ooh, do you want to do that?" Everyone's like, you can end up buying a new engine for a car, but
Could be like an addition to an MOT, couldn't it?
yeah, it's just be something there.
So that you've actually got your MOT's annual. So your annual MOT, as part of it, it could be battery health at this level.
Mileage, so yeah, they could take your battery health. I don't know. Quite interesting. I think there are just some solutions there, because I think on the whole, the government's made this £1 billion fund available to kind of accelerate charger rollout. And I think a few months ago there was loads of newspaper articles about the fact that not a penny of it had been spent. Like, why not? Why not? I mean, that would be really helpful. So yeah, it just feels like, apart from the ZEV mandate, a lot of government activity to promote and encourage and enable uptake of EVs has been quite lacking. One area I will give them credit for is like very low business in kind rates, which has really driven up EV sales to fleets.
Yes.
And you get this all the time. Whenever new car sales come out, one of the attack lines is, yeah, but most of these are to fleet, so they don't count. You're like, why don't they count? They're cars. They're still being driven by people. They've displaced the petrol or diesel car. And also, in 3 to 4 years' time, those brand new fleet EVs will be being sold to private buyers in the second-hand market. In fact, I think the fleet sector has an incredibly important role to drive up the size and health of our second-hand market. So yeah, it has helped that.
Absolutely, because you've got, like you say, the kind of the transition. Then you've got, is it about 3 years before before sort of like cars that go into fleet come out as used, etc. So once they start coming through, then that'll be massive. That again is how we got our Ionic. So it was used as I think it was a subscription vehicle. But literally it was in really, really good nick. And yeah, I was just keeping an eye on Auto Trader and looking for electric, and it had a budget, and and it was great. That and Dr. Ewan McTurk, and having a conversation with me and my husband. So that was the other thing. He's always good. So I was going to say, right, I'm going to ask you a final question. And I know what this answer is. I was going to say, can you leave your job behind when you leave work? You can't, can you?
Not easy. I blame social media for that. It's quite hard not to just occasionally check in on Twitter and just see that, I don't know, someone like Andrew Neil has just spouted a load of nonsense about renewables will result in blackouts or whatever. And it is hard not to engage with that. But it's also but I also like the fact that I'm in a job I'm working on an issue that I really care about, and it's something I still want to kind of follow and keep an eye on when I'm not being paid to do so. Yeah. That's kind of the ideal job, right? Isn't it? It's something that
Absolutely.
It's
Passion.
something you'd be engaged in anyway because you care about it. So
Yeah.
I'm kind of like blessed in that respect. Like, I've also been paid to do this and focus on it. It is hard, and it's always been you do get a bit. It can be a bit depressive, to be quite honest, when you look at what we're up against in making the transition to net zero. I completely understand people's concerns about their personal circumstances and what's important to them and their freedom to do this, and their concern about budgets, particularly in a cost of living crisis. But people just completely sometimes forget why we're doing this anyway. There is a climate crisis happening. It's happening because we're pumping CO2 into the atmosphere year on year. We need to stop doing that. One of the things that does that a lot is how we get around. We need to find solutions. And then because that's now happening, and some people are anxious about that or scared about making that move, then they will challenge or deny the thing that is happening that is making us have to make that move. So I'm seeing a lot more climate change denial, challenging the science on Twitter now, because people don't want to admit they don't want to make the move to EV because they just like the car they have. They're more about, I'm not making that move because I actually challenge and deny the science. You're like, well, it's been put to bed years ago. So seeing that coming up can be a bit hard work, and you feel like you're up against it day in, day out.
You just need to tag my husband in on that one. And
Yeah,
he'll help you
There's
on
going
it.
to be people. This is it. Like, people, oh, so and so said this. You're like, I don't care who so and so is. The vast, overwhelming majority of the scientific community, people with much bigger brains than ours, whose entire lives have been dedicated to objectively and critically analysing the data, have said unequivocally that man-made climate change is happening, and that is
Absolutely.
gonna. There are so many disasters for us as a species and for like all species on Earth if we don't do anything about it. And just ignoring that and thinking you know better is just. I would never dare challenge these people. That's the thing. Like, people go, well, you just say this, and I'm like, these aren't my own opinions. These are opinions based on the evidence produced by the experts who know a lot more about this than I don't. What experts are telling you what your counter opinion is, and
It's Bob down the pub.
yeah,
That's what the
yeah,
experts are. Or my hairdresser said
yeah,
that blah 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 EVs are, or net zero, or climate change is this.
yeah.
So but it's like you said, it's about the confirmation bias as well. People just,
It's about
you
that.
know, and I think some of it also is the fact that people are thinking, well, it ain't my problem because by the time this all hits, I'm going to be gone or whatever, which is quite horrible. But
Let's worry about the world we're leaving our kids.
and the kids and the kids of our kids,
Yep.
etc. So, all of our generations. Do we really, really, really want to leave it in such a crap state that we are kind of heading to? So anyway, let's not end on a negative.
But the positive is that you can do your bit for the climate and tackling the climate crisis by getting an EV. But that's not the only benefit you get.
No,
You save lots of money, hundreds of pounds a year,
yeah,
thousands. Like, literally, once we did the total cost of ownership analysis of like the top 10 selling EVs in 2023 and compared them to their petrol equivalents. And we looked at their total cost of ownership over their lifetime, which was their upfront purchase price, insurance, tax, servicing, and critically fuel. And we found that these things save people. It's well over £10,000 over the lifetime of that vehicle.
God, yeah,
Well over £10,000.
yeah,
That's quite a lot of money back in your pocket. You can spend on other stuff. So
absolutely.
that's what I like. That's what's the good thing about working on the issue of EVs is that then their only benefit isn't just their lower CO2 emissions, their better environmental impact. It's that
It's
it
cheaper.
means it's cheaper service, a lot quicker. A lot of people find them nicer to drive, and we had this really good conversation with OpenReach, who are the second largest fleet operator in the UK, and all their drivers who used to be driving diesel transits and are now in electrics
Yeah,
will report being less fatigued, find them a
yeah,
much better
yeah,
place to
yeah, yeah.
drive, just generally happier with them.
They are lovely. They are lovely cars to drive, honestly, and I end up having to drive quite a lot. So, and I wouldn't, I always thought, gears, I need that. But actually, do you know what? It's peaceful. It's nice. I have my music on. It's just
Being in
lovely.
an EV and then getting back into a diesel absolutely sucks. You're like, oh my God, they're slow. And when I put my foot down, it doesn't take off straight away. I have to
Yeah,
wait for the turbo to like
yeah.
kick in, or
And the braking, you actually have to brake rather than having the one pedal
automatic. It's
driving.
like when you
Yeah,
you want to accelerate and you put your foot down and you've got the automatic needs about half a second to kind of go, I don't know what gear to be in. Oh, okay, let's go in this one. It's just, it's people. There's so many people. Some of the most vocal people in opposition to EVs have never. That's the thing I really dislike. Haven't even bothered trying one. Their opinion hasn't even been formed
no,
by. I've driven both of these. I think electrics aren't good. They're just, and that's one of my main observations I put when I first started working in the sector. Is pretty much the entire EV debate seems to be people who've never owned an EV telling people who own an EV what it's like to own an EV.
yeah, no. It's
That's
madness, isn't
how
it?
so much of the debate boils down to, and it's infuriating. And I'd
Yeah,
encourage people to remember that when they're assessing the source of the information that they're listening to about EVs is, does this person have any lived experience of driving or owning an EV? If not, this
take no
should
notice of
be
them.
with a significant pinch of salt.
Yeah, and talk to one of your friends, neighbours, cousins, second cousins, or whoever who's got one, best mates, and that and just talk to them about it, and they'll give you they'll give you their honest feedback.
Best thing that can be done. Totally.
So, Colin, I'm going to end by saying so for those who want to get hold of Colin or see what he's saying on Twitter or X, whatever, I don't like calling it that, is Colin Walker 79. And I'll share all of this in the show notes as well. And the website for the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit is eciu.net. So all of your links and everything, you're on LinkedIn and everywhere like that, aren't you?
Yep.
So I will share all of that. It's been really, really interesting talking to you.
Pleasure to be
And
here.
I'm glad we've ended up on a positive note. There's been
Yeah.
quite a lot of negative things, but we've ended up on a positive note. And thank you ever so much for your time.
Pleasure.
So to everybody else, thank you for listening and watching, and I shall see you all next time. Bye-bye. Thanks for watching this episode of Electric Evolution. If you enjoyed it, please don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons to stay connected with us. And if you're inspired by our journey towards a sustainable future and want to support our mission on a monthly basis, please check out our Patreon page at patreon.com/Electric Evolution Podcast. Your support really helps us to bring the latest insights and discussions in the world of clean energy, electric vehicles, electric vehicle charging and sustainability to you. If a regular subscription isn't what you're looking for, you can always consider buying us a coffee. Just head over to www.buymeacoffee.com/Electric Evolution Podcast. Every cup helps us to keep the electric evolution moving forwards. And if you're curious about our work in the EV infrastructure sector at Full Circle Continuous Improvement, why not visit us at www.fullcircleci.co.uk to find out more. And if you want to send me a message, you can always email me on liz@fullcircleci.co.uk. And finally, please don't forget to share this podcast if it sparked your interest. And let's keep spreading the word about all of these topics that we're covering. So, until next time, see you soon. Bye.